Hello, everybody. After the last lecture by Mr. Hill, which I know because I've lived in Antwerp for 5 years, I feel like I have to give some completely different lecture. And I'll just pick out some words because everything I'm going to say has a whole lot to do with what he said, and I have a completely different view on society and the world. It starts with trust, I'll admit that one. Trust is a basic thing when it comes to cultural dialogue and interreligious dialogue and so on. But that is exactly the problem. There's a whole lot of distrust, and not so much on the other side. The distrust is within ourselves, it's within the European culture. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we look at cultural diplomacy as if we're gonna do some dialogue with the other cultures. It's the others which are culturalized, and we do not culturalize ourselves. We don't even have a clue what our culture is about. One of the fun things about our culture is that basically, like many of the examples given were things about entrepreneurship, about business, for the simple matter that our culture right now, today, has become a monoculture of global consumption. A global consumption society, that's the vision. And everybody else is being dragged into it. And all in all, if you travel the world a bit, you can be optimistic and all fun about it. But half of the time, all cultures are eradicated because of that culture. Only look at the way we dress. For example, when we talk about cultural dialogue, we're not talking about cultural dialogue. We're trying to universalize other people into a Western culture. Look at dresses, for example. If an Arab, a Chinese, an African dresses in Western clothes, there's no problem. Nobody will comment. If a Western person wears Arab, African, or Chinese clothes, he's either a tourist, or he's a hippie, or he has an identity problem. There's really a bit of a blindness in our own culture, and it's quite huge. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about. Oh yeah, the last thing I want to mention, because it's a typical thing that comes up again and again. Oh, those bad other cultures like the Taliban in Afghanistan and so on, and the people in Mali. That's a completely modern phenomenon. When Sunnis are bombing Shiites in Pakistan at the moment, that didn't used to be the case 50, 60 years ago. It's a thing that originated within the aftermath of colonialism. It's something that originates within nationalism. Let's take something typical that everybody equates with the culture of Islam, like suicide bombing, which is absolutely ridiculous within Islam. But we associate it with it. Now, when you look at the research being done about suicide bombing, all the research shows that 90 or 80% of suicide bombers in the last 15 or 20 years have all been secular suicide bombers. They were, for example, the big majority is the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka and in India. Those are the biggest group of suicide bombers. And when you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, suicide bombing only originated after the occupation of Afghanistan, after the occupation of Iraq, and the moment they left Iraq, suicide bombing declined and almost disappeared, except for the couple of instances with sectarian conflict, which didn't used to be there and which is there now. So we have a bit of a blind spot for what we are doing and creating in the world. And when we come back to Antwerp, it's all nice to talk about 160, 56 or whatever cultures we have. Yes, it's true and it's great and it's a fun city to be in. But somebody wearing a headscarf can't be sitting at the desk to register somebody in the municipality because he might not be neutral. If the person is neutral in his dealings, that should be all fine. So Muslims in Antwerp particularly feel very distrusted. And yes, they distrust the politics because they haven't trusted Muslims for the last 20 years or something. So it makes me a bit angry to talk about, oh, let's just export our culture. What the hell are we exporting? So, to say why I am saying all these kinds of things, all in all, oh, that's a little mistake there. We'll go to the first thing. Myself, you've heard a bit of my CV, but the most important part probably is that I'm the Halal monk at the moment. It's a bit of a project. It's a personal project. I go around the world and I have interviews, conversations with some of the more influential on an international level theologians and spiritual leaders of the Islamic world, and the more well-known artists of the Islamic world. For example, you see Kuti Erguner, which is the last master of Ottoman Sufi music. It's on the bottom. Then you have Amina Wadud, who's a feminist Muslim theologian who leads prayer in America and is controversial because of it. Or one of the 50 most influential people on the top is Abdul Hakim Murad. He's a scholar in Cambridge, but also in Al-Azhar, whatever. So I have conversations with these people, and that's what I've been dealing with for a couple of years now. Now, to just explain a bit about European Islam and the point it's at today, because it's useful to understand what we have when we talk about the Muslim community. First of all, from nationality Islam to strand Islam. So many Muslim groups came to Europe simply because they were migrant workers, and certainly in Flanders, for example, they started working in the mines and so on and so on. So basically, those were groups of rural people coming from their particular national background, and that's what they took with them. You'd have Turkish Muslims, you'd have Moroccan Muslims, and so on and so on. That's kind of how they felt. That's also how in the last 20 years they've been treated. Like, if there was a problem with racism, which there was, it was a problem with the Turks, with the Moroccans, with now the Bulgarians, and so on and so on. But since 9/11, everything changed, of course, and you get a problem with Islam as such. And all of a sudden, they're not Turks and not Moroccans anymore. They have become to be seen as those Muslims, and those Muslims supposedly have a problem. Now, those Muslims themselves, because they are the third and fourth generation and so on, and those as well start connecting themselves as Muslims, partly because they're pushed to do so, and partly because that's their background now. They don't have the connection with the country where their parents and grandparents were born in, because they're the third and fourth generation. So they're in this global age where everybody's looking for identity. Of course, Islam is a big thing. But one thing I mentioned is Muslim gurus. It's not the only new evolution, but it is an evolution. They don't necessarily look to the scholars of the country of origin of their grandfathers, of course not, but they'll go and listen to speeches and lectures of important, I call them gurus, like spiritual leaders with a lot of following who have new, innovative things to say, sometimes conservative, sometimes liberal, that doesn't matter. What else did I need to say? Oh yeah, that there's within that big group of people, and that's not just a European thing, that's a global thing. I think if you look at all the religions today and their global community, I think the most busy one when it comes to talks and dialogue and interesting discussions is actually Islam, because it's being pushed all over the world. The whole idea of a problem with Islam is not just a European idea, it's something you'll find all over the world. And so there's a lot of internal debates. There's influential scholars. Some of them become a bit guru-like, others don't, are just high scholars. And that's what I mean with, you've got everything in Europe at the moment, from flower power Sufis to the bearded jihadis. Yes, they're all there. But the big majority is right in the middle, is something like a hardworking, normal Muslim who goes to work, comes home, tries to feed his kids, goes to bed, and is happy with his life. And so there's a bunch of Dutch and German Muslims, and they've all made similar clips following that new tradition of showing that there's happy Muslims. It gives a lot of debate on the internet and on Facebook and so on. But one of the things that you have to realize is, why the hell do they have to do it? What do you see? Just the normalist of normalist people just dancing, and they call themselves Muslims, so they're happy Muslims. I like the clip. There's people who say you shouldn't do that. You don't always have to portray that you're a happy Muslim. That's an option. But that's what's interesting for me. There's a bunch of Muslims who have the feeling that they have to do it. That the rest of the world thinks this is something very bizarre. Dancing and fun Muslims. Where the hell are they? Well, they're all around because you don't recognize them. Not every Muslim walks around with a beard and a Kalashnikov or something. So Not at all. So what the thing is that, yes, we do have Islamophobia in the West. And yes, it's a part of our culture. And so, yes, of course, Islam has a bunch of problems all over the world. But if we're going to criticize those, then we also have to criticize our own problems. And we have to dare to call them part of our culture. If supposedly every problem in the Muslim world comes from being Muslim, and it partly has to do with its cultural roots and traditions and histories and stuckness of scholarship and all you want, but that's not my topic. My topic is that first you have to see how your own psychological problems deal or are connected to your own culture. And so Islamophobia is one of those expressions that we have within our culture, which is a big fear of the other, namely Islam, which has been there for centuries. And still, Muslims in the European Union are about 19 million, so 3.8% in total. In Belgium, that's about 10%. 10%, that's quite a lot. So that makes for a big problem. If somebody who wears a headscarf is not capable of working in the municipality at the desk, that's a strange thing. And then to kind of circumvent it, there was even talk about not letting gay people wear their rainbow T-shirts and whatever. That's how far this whole neutrality idea goes, but it starts with the fear of Islam. Now, from nationality racism to religious discrimination after 9/11, I've had and then another point is that it's real. If it's not just Amnesty International, it's a bunch of NGOs warning for Islamophobia. And you see it in burqa bans, in headscarf debates, in debates about minarets, which are not allowed to be built, and so on, while every church should be allowed to do so, and so on. It's not that Islamophobia is a specific set of things of thinking, it's a type of fear and of monolithizing the whole Islamic culture, acting as if there's no difference within Islam, as if there is only one Islam that has always been like that is not capable of evolving, and so on. It's a concept of Islam that makes you fearful of the other. Now, the burqa ban is a perfect example. So people aren't allowed in Belgium, in France, and so on to wear a burqa, and the whole fully covering clothing. There's about, people think, because there's no real research, but about 100 of those women in Belgium. So because of 100 women who have never done anything wrong, we've created a law which does not allow them to wear it. So we took the freedom of religion, we took it away because of some perceived threat of security, which has never been a real threat, which is strange if you look at it from a real juridical perspective. But it's not a juridical perspective that we take when we discuss these things. That should be obvious. So, being said, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of variety within the Muslim community today, but we are fearful of it. It makes us not see people like Aki Nawaz, for example. He is a guy, he's from London for 20 years, he's an outspoken Muslim, but he's always been a very active human rights defender, very critical of British society, but just as well of his own Pakistani community. That doesn't matter. Now, the guy, like I say, human rights, hip-hop, he started as a punker. So he came from the punk scene of the 80s in London, still is a bit of a punker. That's why he's always that critical. That's why he's into human rights and so on. Still outspoken Muslim, not just outspoken. He goes to Pakistan and he finds the real old religious traditional music people of Pakistan. For example, Mausam Fateh Ali Khan, who's a nephew of, who some people might know, Nusrat. This is the type of music that comes out of it. What you're seeing here is punk music with on top of religious devotion, and they're actually singing a devotional song to Ali, which is the nephew and the son-in-law of the Prophet. So it's one big thank you and praise to Ali. That's it, and that's the traditional way of doing it, with a lot of vocal improvisation, and then together with the hip-hop punk. So why do I take this? I take this because for me, it's a bit of an example of expression within the current 4th and 3rd generation Muslim community. That's the stuff that's living. That's the stuff that's creating their own cultural awareness. This kind of fusion of modernity and tradition. And that's the stuff that we can't understand. That's why we can only make this fundamentalist thing and moderate thing. But what to do with a guy like Aki Nawaz, who's a fervent human rights agent and still is tremendously religious. What do we do with it? We have this false dichotomy that somebody who's really religious is dangerous and somebody who's moderate, whatever it is, that's the good guy. But that in itself is a cultural imposition. I'm a theologian, I'm a Christian, I'm extremely faithful if I look at myself. I'm completely convinced of the existence of God to say something, of his benevolence, and of the fact that he has to work through me to get to a better world. That's what I'm convinced of, and I'm not too scared to say it, but it's a strange thing to say. And when you say it, people look a bit of like, ooh, he's a bit of a freak, isn't he? And I hope I'm not. So we have this incapability of understanding religious evolutions, which produces the fact that we can't deal with the Muslim community. We don't know who to talk to. We don't know who the new pivotal people are within the community who create these kind of new types of hybridity and new types of culture which go beyond the global consumption culture. So we're blind to all the debates which are happening, which basically focus on this idea of tradition and modernity and how to fuse them into one, which Ziauddin Sardar, which is a famous critic in England, calls transmodernity. Now, and that's why we can't perceive things like this. A Muslim woman within a Western liberal view is by definition subdued when she wears a headscarf. No, fourth-generation Muslim women are, in Belgium, some of the most active on the political level, extremely active. That's why they get so angry and they feel so distrusted when they can't get a job in schools or whatever. And this is the type of woman that they want to be. Strong, independent, and self-chosen, and so on. Even the burqa ban, even that one, when people did some research in Holland, it's the only research I know about, they interviewed 50 to 75 people, most of them chose to wear the burqa, even to that level that their husbands didn't want them to wear it, but they chose to wear it anyways, and the husbands left them. So when it comes to female agency, we need to rethink the whole thing. So recognizing, kind of get to the end of the thing, recognizing our own modernist secular paradigm. I think that's what we need to do if we really want to build a cultural bridge. Otherwise, it's impossible, and it's simply imposing our own culture. So, and I think part of the subconscious is not to debate it as wrong or bad or not. It's just to realize what it is. First of all, which has been a red thread through all I said, secularization as something seemingly inevitable. If there will be enough scientific evolution and enough progress, we'll leave God behind. We didn't. Nobody did. The West is also still full of New Age. We don't understand why it's there. Well, it's because perhaps people need it and it makes some sense to be religious and spiritual. We have a politics of nation-state, like I say, it has a lot to do with modern terrorism and so on. It has much to do with nation-state and with drawing lines and making borders in ways that in Africa didn't make sense, that in the Middle East didn't make sense, and so on. And it's a bit the same thing. It's also this classifying of cultures is also something that most cultures didn't do. Like, for example, again, the Sunni and the Shia is a division which has been there sometimes, but not most of the times it wasn't. Most people in Pakistan, I'll give an example. There's this woman, she's called Halal, and she's a famous female saint from the 12th century in Kashmir. Her shrine, people would go to it, they would be Sunni, Shia, and Hindu. People would have forgotten whether she was Hindu or Muslim. But that's something that in our nation state and nation states connected to their culture doesn't make sense. But that's what makes sense in half of the world. Half of the world, or 80%, is a hybrid thing. So, and then scientific truth as the highest correctness, this idea that religious and spiritual ways of dealing with the world would be less important. That in itself is disastrous if you want to have a real cultural dialogue. Because half of the time, science doesn't say anything about ourselves. It doesn't say anything about how to be kind, about how to be compassionate, and so on and so on. That's what religions do, and that's why they're so hugely important, and half of the time more important than science. Not to say that science didn't do great stuff, of course, it did. An economy of capitalism and industrialization, I think it's just, that's what it is. And that's obviously also something that infuriates a lot of people all over the world. Why not an economy based more on rural sets of cultural understanding and so on. It could be done. And then the last thing I'll come to is, together with this capitalism and industrialization and with the scientific progress thing, there is a myth, and we don't see it as a myth. We see it, again, as the inevitable, as the deculturalized, normal flux of the world where everything will eventually become a bit like we are. It won't, and it's a myth in there. There's an almost religious conviction and at least a very cultural conviction that we're up to the top, up and up and up, and it's impossible, and we've all known it. Nobody, if the whole world lives like people in the West, we all know it, then we need 2 or 3 or 4 other globes. It's impossible. And again, frugality and all those kinds of things are things that religions deal with, which brings in people like, for example, Ajaz Khan. He works for a secular NGO now, but he's an expert in microfinance. And as an expert in microfinance, he comes from a Muslim tradition where people are rethinking that whole thing of not asking interest. I'll admit that lots of Islamic banking or Sharia-compliant banking isn't Sharia-compliant at all. It's a bit of a hassle to just make modern banking seem like Islamic banking while it's not. So, but discounting that, the fact is that people are thinking about it, that maybe it made sense and how to implement it. And he found, at least for development work, a couple of ideas, new ideas that are really working. Billions of people are following now and giving some money without wanting loans back directly to farmers in Pakistan and so on and so on. I'm just saying he's a guy who took his tradition and put it within a new style of thinking. So that to overcome the tension that we have with the Islamic community, certainly in Europe, but on a global level, do we dare to talk from within religion and to step out of this supposedly neutral, secularized version of non-culture, which is culture after all? And I'll give an example, the Halal and the Feast of Sacrifice. I guess it's in a lot of other countries as well, but certainly in Belgium, every time that the Feast of Sacrifice arrives, then the Muslims are the big butchers again and the primitive guys who don't care about the animals and so on. Let me tell you one thing, the way we slaughter animals has never been nice, and the way our industrialized way of slaughtering animals has come to exist had nothing to do with animal welfare. It had everything to do with consumption, with going faster, with needing more animals slaughtered faster. And that's exactly the same problem that we have at the Feast of Sacrifice. There's too many Muslims, there's not enough possibilities to do something decent with the animals, and so you get awful images. But that's not what Muslims want. If you look within the Islamic tradition, the animals have to be treated right. Only a very good expert can do the slaughtering, and so on and so on. There's plenty of rules which actually go for the animal welfare. But never ever do you hear politicians go that far to come to this understanding which is obviously there. We all want the benefit of the animals. And what we do not put into question is the way we handle our own animal production. But we all frame it on the Muslims. So to get out of it, we can find each other, but we have to dig deep within our own problems and our own cultural stucknesses. And then that's the last one. I think one of the stucknesses is that we left spirituality behind. I don't want to make it sound like this floaty concept. I only want to make it sound like ethics does not just come from a logical perspective on the world. That has never motivated people. If you want real ethics to be lived, look at religion. I'm not saying everybody has to be religious, absolutely not. But there's a sense of soul, which is an aspect, a dimension of being human that we have negated for the last 2, 3, 4 centuries. And that one is something that we have to talk about. And again, that's the one that the Muslim world at the moment is debating all over the globe. Thank you. My point is that there needs to be a balance. Obviously, religion has been abused all over the world, all through history, but everything has been abused. And again, that's the same thing. Yes, that's a problem. It will be abused. I'm not saying it has to be in schools necessarily. I'm also not against it. It might be a very good idea to see how religious education has dealt with education all through history and what it has learned to people and how they became more ethical and moral through it in the good ways. Find the life-giving aspects of every part of the tradition, the life-giving aspects of modernity, the life-giving aspects of religion, and get those out. But we need to integrate it. If we're going to say, oh, religion, that's a problem because the moment you touch it, it gets into power play and into a problem. Everything turns into a problem. Science as well. We always act as if religion is the big boogeyman of the world. But if you look at some of the worst atrocities of the last centuries, or the last 2 centuries, I mean, atomic bombs weren't religious inventions. They're inventions by a scientific monoculture of progress that without any ethical boundaries decided to test a bomb like that. More than 100,000 people in less than 2 minutes. Nobody ever talks about how that is a part of our, again, culture, subconscious psychology, and so on, the paradigm that leads it. We don't talk about it. And in the moment religions do something bad, so the same, would I want to destroy science and get it out because it creates something like the atomic bomb? Of course not. Science needs to be there, but it needs to be controlled. And actually, I think it can be controlled by systems of morality, all sorts of them. And the same with religion. If religion goes a bit haywire, you need a bit of rational ground to say, oh, come on, these are the statistics, these are a bit the lines and whatever. They need to balance each other. And we've lost a balance there. And I think more than other cultures through history have done. It's indeed similar, but what I just would like to add is, what I'm also not trying to do is exempt religion from problems. No, on the contrary, there's lots of problems. And if there are problems, you have to deal with them from all the dimension of the problem. I think I'll give another example. When people talk about circumcision of women or something, which is an absolute horror, that's a good example. Many people think that it's a Muslim thing. It's not. It's a Nile thing. When you come closer to the Nile, then you get more of circumcision. And the Christians closer to the Nile will just as much do it as the Muslims and so on. But then what do Muslims do? They extract religion from it and they say, oh, it's a cultural problem. It's not a religious problem. Our religion is exempt from this kind of faults. That's not true, because there's imams and so on who actually advocate through their religion for the circumcision. Same thing on the Christian side. And at that moment, it becomes a religious problem. It is within the religious community, and the religious community has to deal with it, which happens as well, because in Egypt, quite close to the Nile, the University of Al-Azhar has made several fatwas denying that circumcision for females would be something allowed by Islam. So it's not. But still, the discussion is there and within religion, and we don't... What I wanted to add was that we can't extract religion either and see it as the one salvation or something, or let's say mysticism or spirituality. That's not what I'm saying. Everything can be used and abused and whatever. You have to balance the whole. You have to be honest, and again, honest about our own culture and our own subconscious as well. And we act as if we don't have one. In the West, I mean. Yeah. The concept of identity is hugely important today, in indeed different times, which are globalized times, and everybody needs to rethink identity. And I think that's half of what I'm talking about. How will we do it? Will we impose a certain type of identity that comes from a power structure, which happens to be still in the West? Will that be an imposed identity, or will we truly have a cultural dialogue? I think part of the answer lies in, I'm not going to go into big debates about the history. Obviously, the power play that religion has played in the Western history and so on is big. But that's part of the things that we have to research, that we have to look deeper into what it's still, what's the connection still today, and truly to our mindsets and our own cultures. What has it done to us? What has it brought us? Colonialism and so on, which is not that far away, but still it was also pretty much religiously approved half of the time. But that one as well, we haven't dealt with colonialism really. We think we do, and sometimes in Belgium we talk about, our sad past in Congo. Our sad past in Congo? We fucked up the half of Africa, so to say. Very sorry, pardon my French, but that's basically... But even because you can't say those things, that's the problem. We can... It's all allowed to again, to demonize Muslims, but I can't say such a thing with the anger I have with it, because I'm angry about it. We do not look at our colonial past. It's just an example. So we need to dig back into that history. It's one of the things we need to do. Cultural diplomacy, in a sense, will always exist. People will always engage. So actually, there's not really a problem. But one of the things that we need to do is track back our own culture before we can reasonably engage with the others and reasonably see how the others have evolved, because they evolved in completely different ways half of the time. And half of the time, we put their history in a framework of our history. So the redigging in our own history has a lot to do with that one as well, with allowing history to be different than we always thought it was. Because history in itself as a subject has mostly been, again, for example, that Lal Dad I talked about, everybody worshipped her, Hindus, Muslims, Sunnis, Shia, whatever. Everybody did so. But in the 50s, when Pakistan and India split, nation-state ID, then you get academics and historians on both sides writing treatises about Lal Dad. And the Pakistanis claimed her to be Muslim, and the Hindus claimed her to be Hindu. And hence you had a history of Lal Dad, which was totally framed within the way we look at history, and because we've done it for such a long time, which has, by the way, a lot to do with Christianity and the way Christianity expressed itself as a culture and as a view, as the universal culture and so on, that everybody had to accept and so on. Islam has a lot less of that. All through history, if you look at the history of Islam, never did so, or almost never did so. Of course, there were instances of eradication of the other, but at large, Islam has never forcefully converted other religions. It had more problems with internal frictions than it had with Christians or Jews or whatever. So Islam spread mainly all through North Africa and to India. It had political clashes, but Islam itself as a religion spread non-violently. And those are also things that we do not wish to see. We need to think of religion as something that violently imposes itself, because Christianity has done that a lot of times.